Hello, students. It's Dr. Newmark here. This is your weekly highlights video for week 7. This is a lot of content, so let's jump right in. Okay, so the first thing that you read, I don't know what order you read them in, but when I was preparing for this, I was looking at James Hyman's dissertation first. This is actually, over 2 decades old at this point. He's currently an associate professor. I don't remember where, but I did look it up somewhere in the Midwest. But I thought this was a really interesting study. So the topic that he was concerned with was this contamination that was emitting from a waste facility in Ames, Iowa, and the toxic plume, as it were, was spreading to the north towards an Inuit community, Nunavut. So the study that he was concerned with primarily was this report, the commoner report, and then there was a response to it by some scientists from his institution that was in effect a refutation of the findings from the commoner report. So Hyman is interested in his study in how scientific discourse actually reflects an intersection of special cases of situated discourses, the judicial, the political, and the scientific. Perhaps traditionally, scientific discourse has been considered forensic in Aristotelian terms, but many argue that it is actually epideictic, educating and initiating new members, validating and celebrating traditional knowledge, and defending the culture's orthodoxy from heretical claims against its traditional and knowledge, tradition and knowledge. You've probably studied epideictic rhetoric and other classes you've taken here at UNM. And there are many famous examples of epideictic oratory that you can learn about online through many interesting videos and sample texts and scholarly attentions to it. Maybe you've come across it before, but in this context, Hyman discusses it at considerable length in this context of the Commoner Report. So Hyman gives a quick gloss to the history of the scientific report as the expression of scientific discourse following Bazerman's historical work. I found this really interesting because I tell my students in the biology department when they're working on scientific scholarly reports that the report itself is the vehicle by which the public learns about the science that you've done. The science, to some, would continue to exist in a vacuum without some way of communicating it. I think it's important to keep that in mind. So Hyman's main purpose is to reveal science itself as a civic discourse with highly epideictic and deliberative purposes. So Hyman organizes his study around 3 categories of inquiry within the Nunavut-Ames controversy, which are genre and delivery, frames and values, and ethos and identity and image. You didn't learn about all of these because you only read parts of the dissertation. I have here on the screen a little blurb from the Time from Radio Iowa that was a popular press consideration of this issue. The study blames Ames power plant for pollution. That would be the Commoner Report. So Spangle and Knapp, which Hyman refers to in the dissertation, offered 4 general principles to guide public discourse that promotes empowerment for all parties involved in the resolution of environmental controversies. And they are these: reducing moral positioning, focusing on common ground, downplaying dramatic approaches, and creating a new model for data disputes. Now, I have on the screen here a little image of the forensic files, and Hyman also mentions shows like NCIS, which reveal or suggest to the common viewing public that there are certain indisputable methodologies within scientific study. And this is often strategized in very dramatic fashion because these are meant to entertain the public. And NCIS is a franchise that is wildly popular and has had really strong impacts on the public's understanding of scientific methods and their legislative impacts even. So how do the rhetorical strategies that Hyman presents intend to prepare citizens to participate in local affairs, wherein meaning is collectively engineered from many types of knowledge, not just science? And individuals are empowered by rhetorical education, not just an education in rhetoric. I'm not really going to probe that, that question, that that dualistic concept here. But what is the difference between a rhetorical education and an education in rhetoric? So I wonder if you backed up on this question. Who is Barry Commoner and what textual outputs did he produce and for what audiences? I have here on the screen the first page, the cover of this Tracking Dioxins report. This is just a 4-page report, which you can find on the NACC website. Actually, the CEC website is where you'll find it. It's over 20 years old now, but it's still like their 12th most popularly downloaded report. So this is the short version that I have on the screen here. And you can read, if you look at this closely in full screen, that says, in a groundbreaking NACC study conducted by a team led by scientist Barry Commoner and the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems, dioxins falling in the new polar territory of Nunavut are linked to their source regions thousands of kilometers away. And I had to move closer to my screen to read that to you. But this was indeed a groundbreaking study, and it was very sort of destabilizing within Ames, Iowa, that the local waste management approach was having impacts on a community of Indigenous people thousands of miles to the north, or thousands of kilometers to the north. So Commoner, based on data from this high split model, was able to identify the main source of toxins found in Inuit mothers' milk and in their food sources. Commoner did not recommend a regulatory approach, but rather direct individualized approaches for redress. That is something that Hyman goes into, I think, at length in an interesting way. I'm not going to really elaborate on that here, but I ask you, how do reports used for policymaking reveal the challenges between content that is in fact epideictic, but may be assumed to be forensic? He describes these different rhetorical approaches and their styles and their assumptions. So the report genre itself projects the image of science, that's capital S science. And he does at some length describe the differences between these, which I'll come back to in a future slide. So a primary feature of the report for policymaking is its focus on stimulating communal activity as opposed to stifling it by demanding immediate policy now. So that report that I showed you on the previous page was intended to influence policymaking. So it's very different than a scientific study or something that is created within the vacuum of the government, like some of the statements that you've read in prior weeks and others that you've read this week and last week regarding the checker spot. They are created by governmental entities with collaborations by scientists, but they exist within this governmental legislative space. That is like what Commoner produced is sort of like a nonprofit output that is meant to influence policymaking. It's in a quasi-governmental space, I suppose you could think of it. Rather than making a particular demand, the intention is to influence people's attitudes, and thereby they will put pressure towards legislative change or policy changes. So Hyman, following another scholar, Rood, explains the balance of forensic, epideictic, and deliberative rhetorics that make the form and content of reports for environmental policy different from traditional scientific reports. And we're going to see that in the next example from this week. So Rood's 6 characteristics of scientific reports used in making public policy become the aspects Hyman locates in the Commoner report. And there's a really systematic strategy that he uses to view the report through those features as kinds of lenses to look at the mechanics of how the report functions. So Julie McIntyre's dissertation was something that was produced within UNM. Habitat variables, mammal interactions, and recovery approaches important to a rare New Mexico butterfly, the checker spot. So I want you to think about like some of the big differences between what Commoner was trying to do in that study, which is the subject itself of Hyman's dissertation, which itself has a goal, and McIntyre has a goal in her study, which the topmost goal you might think is to get the PhD. but it is also to influence other scientists' knowledge base about this pollinator, this butterfly, and hopefully to support like preservation and conservation goals towards this butterfly, its habitat, its host plant, and other butterflies. So why do you think it was necessary for McIntyre to state that the butterfly's response to climate change might be indicative of impacts to other species, including humans? That's in the introduction to the dissertation itself, but she makes an effort to indicate that it is sort of an indicative species of sort of larger ecological impacts. So in the introduction to McIntyre's chapter 1, each of the chapters kind of is structured as a scientific article in and of itself. So it has an introduction, which is also a literature review. But so in the introduction to chapter 1, McIntyre is trying to establish the butterfly population's relationships with local ecological conditions relative to temperature, nectar sources, host plants, and habitat area. So why is it important to establish such a broad significance and a broad conception of these like network relationships? Why do you think that that is good science from your understanding of scientific composition in prose at this point in the semester? So relative to Hyman's distinctions between science and science, capital S and lowercase s, the latter being a rhetorical activity, what rhetorical strategies do you see at play in McIntyre's work? Like what tradition is McIntyre working within regarding big S science and small s science, the science that she is doing? So in chapter 2, McIntyre intends to explain the impacts of multi-species interactions on the butterfly. Some species behaviors and impacts, such as those of the pocket gopher or elk, may seem more natural than those of others, such as grazing cattle. I would add, knowing this landscape, I know the landscape that the checker spot has as its native habitat pretty well. I've walked through it. I've seen the impacts of gophers, elk, and grazing cattle. And to me, the grazing cattle seem to be a much more invasive impact than do the elk and the pocket gophers. But I'm not a scientist, but I'm just observing this from my eyes perspective. And as you've learned from the video from Simon Dinesky, it's actually the stakeholders in the cattle grazing realm that have been historically most opposed to the preservation of the checker spot's habitat. So I'll just leave that at that for now. So I want us to consider some intertextual ideas at the close of this video. And these are actually the questions that are going to be in this week's discussion board. So I'm just going to read them to you, and you can choose one to consider for your post in the discussion board. There was a lot of content for this week, very different kinds of content. But I want you to think about it all under this umbrella of scientific writing, because it all can fit within that large concept. So when considering scientific reports intended to impact policy as compared to scientific scholarly outputs, what readerly strategies might we employ to critically examine rhetorical strategies relative to audiences' values and goals? Commoner had a specific audience. What were their values and goals? The Iowa professor who wrote the scientific response to the Commoner report also had certain values and goals. And then Julie McIntyre in her dissertation about the checker spot butterfly, what were her values and goals? Is that worthwhile to suss out, to determine? So you did not read the Commoner report itself, I don't think, unless you looked for it, but rather a scholarly study about it, which was Hyman's study, which was in part about that. So, but from what you were able to detect, what were some of its strategies, the Commoner report strategies, for connecting scientific research and modeling to arguing for specific changes to human behavior going forward? Hyman is systematic about outlining these strategies. And finally, so when reading McIntyre's dissertation, you can assess her goals as she states them plainly. The goal is not only to contribute to conservation of this rare butterfly, but also to understand what abiotic, biotic, and spatial patterns potentially are important to similar butterflies and other members of the globally declining pollinator community. And Simon Dinesky actually touched upon the checker spot butterfly is like this charismatic species, this pollinator species that could perhaps galvanize attention towards other species in their decline and the preservation of their habitat. So given the context of Julie McIntyre's dissertation, a PhD dissertation in UNM's biology department, what benefit might come from applying some of Hyman's analytical tools? What benefit might come to us as scholars in this particular class you're in right now, English 513? So what benefit might come from applying some of Hyman's analytical tools, which he applies to the commoner report in Ames's response, the town of Ames's response, to McIntyre's written output regarding the checker spot status and its future? So that was a really dense question, but it'll be in the discussion board prompt so you can deconstruct it and make sense of it there. But on that note, I'm gonna finish recording this video, and I hope you enjoyed the readings for this week, dense though they were.